a new visitor from the high peaks. Welcome, wanderer. Are you lost, tired from a long climb through ice and thin air? Well then, sit down, come close to the fire, catch your breath, let the cold leave your fingers, and look up for a moment at the sky. Do you see the stars? Good, because tonight's story starts up there, far beyond what any of us can reach, in a place so vast and so old that the word ancient barely begins to cover it. Tonight we are going to talk about a mountain, the highest peak in all of Runeterra, a place where gods come down to wear mortal skin, where the sky literally opens if you are worthy enough to reach the top, where two faiths went to war over which light to follow, where a dragon made of starfire was tricked into slavery and has been patiently waiting for revenge ever since. Are you comfortable? Good. Then let us begin. Mount Targon is not a mountain the way most mountains are mountains. Most mountains are simply very large pieces of geology. Impressive, certainly. Occasionally dangerous, but fundamentally passive. They are shaped by forces, not by intent. They do not watch you. They do not test you. They do not decide whether you are worthy of seeing what is at their top. Mount Targon does all of these things. It is the highest peak in all of Runeterra, so tall that its summit is above the clouds in a way that most mountains are not. At its base, the sky above you is already extraordinary, packed with celestial bodies that are visible even in daylight, stars and moons and comets and constellations arranged in patterns that the people living in the mountain's base have been reading for generations as signs and messages. Astronomers from across Runeterra have made pilgrimages to the mountain's foot specifically to study this sky, because the clarity and richness of what is visible there has no parallel anywhere else on the continent. And that's before you even start climbing. The climb itself is not simply physically difficult, though it is that genuinely lethally difficult, killing the vast majority of people who attempt it through exposure or falls or altitude sickness or the predators that live on its upper slopes. But the mountain also tests in ways that go beyond the physical. As climbers gain altitude, the mountain confronts them with visions, hallucinations, or something more than hallucinations, depending on who you ask. Manifestations of their fears, their regrets, the moments that define them, the parts of themselves they would prefer not to look at directly. Most climbers who survive the physical danger turn back because of the visions. They cannot face what the mountain shows them. The ones who push through, who do not look away, who reach the summit anyway, find something waiting for them there. The sky opens, and what is beyond it reaches back. What reaches back is something called an aspect. And understanding what an aspect is requires understanding the cosmology of Targon, which is one of the most genuinely fascinating and most cosmically scaled world-building structures in all of League of Legends. Above the physical world of Runeterra, beyond the summit of the mountain, there exists something called Targon Prime. It is described as a city of gold and silver, bathed in celestial light, a place that exists beyond the physical realm, in a dimension accessible only through the mountain or through the kind of cosmic entity that doesn't need geography to travel. The inhabitants of Targon Prime are the aspects, beings of pure conceptual power, each one embodying an abstract principle: the sun, the moon, war, protection, twilight, the hunt. Each aspect is not just a powerful being, it is the living embodiment of a concept so fundamental that it has a presence in reality simply by virtue of existing. The aspects are not gods in the sense of creators or benevolent caretakers. They are forces. They have purposes, but those purposes are cosmic in scale, related to the defense of the world against threats that most of Runeterra's population doesn't know exist and couldn't conceptualize if they did. The void is the primary concern. The aspects have been aware of the void threat for as long as they have existed, and everything they do, including the selection and transformation of mortal hosts, is oriented, at least partially, toward that defense. This means that being chosen by an aspect is not necessarily a gift, even if it is experienced as one. The aspect of war didn't choose Atreus because it loved him. It chose him because it needed a body capable of carrying its power into the world, and Atreus happened to be the most suitable vessel available at the time. The transformation is real, the power is real, and the host's connection to the aspect can become a genuine relationship over time. But the relationship begins from a position of profound asymmetry. The aspect chooses, the mortal is chosen, and not every host is comfortable with what that means for their autonomy. Before going further, it is worth sitting with the scale of what the aspects actually are, because this is one of those cases where the lore genuinely earns the word cosmic and uses it correctly. The aspects are not supernatural beings in the way that most fantasy settings use that term. They are not powerful mages who achieved immortality, or ancient gods who were worshipped into existence, or elemental forces that crystallized into consciousness. They are embodied concepts, ideas so fundamental to the structure of reality that they exist as presences, as forces, independent of any physical form. The aspect of the sun is not a being who controls sunlight. It is what the sun means, given consciousness and purpose. Each aspect was present before Runeterra existed in its current form. They watched the world develop from Targon Prime with a kind of patient, strategic attention. They guided the development of civilizations directly when they felt it necessary, through the slow provision of knowledge and the occasional selection of a mortal host. The sun disk that powered Shurima's ascension ritual was ultimately the result of aspect guidance. They needed armies capable of facing the void. They needed a world that could defend itself, and so they worked, over centuries through multiple civilizations, toward that capacity. This is the thing that makes the aspects genuinely alien rather than simply powerful. Their relationship to individual mortal lives is not uncaring, but it is not their primary concern. They care about Runeterra as a world that must survive. They care about the defense against the void as an imperative that supersedes most other considerations. Individual people matter to them largely insofar as those people serve the larger purpose. Some aspect hosts accept this, some don't, and the tension between what the aspect needs and what the mortal host values is one of the most consistently rich sources of drama in Targon's champion stories. The tribes who have always lived at the mountain's base exist in two main factions, the Solari and the Lunari. The Solari are the larger and more dominant group, a religious order that worships the sun as the source of divine power and cosmic order. They are martial, disciplined, and deeply certain of their own rightness. They train their warriors from childhood in the Horak, an elite fighting force that serves as both the Solari's military arm and its religious police. Their power at the mountain's base is substantial, their reach into Targon's culture pervasive. The Horak patrol the mountain's lower slopes, manage the trade routes that pass near the mountain's base, and enforce the Solari's religious edicts with the efficiency of people who have been doing this for so many generations that they no longer question whether they should. The Solari are not villains in a simple sense. Their faith is real and their commitment to it is genuine. They believe sincerely that the sun's supremacy over the moon is not just theological preference, but cosmic fact, that the moon is darkness, that darkness is danger, and that the Lunaries' worship of it is therefore a genuine threat to the world rather than simply a competing religious preference. This conviction, held in good faith, produces behavior that looks from the outside like fanaticism. Most convictions about absolute truth do. The Lunari are their shadow, a smaller, older, and for most of the modern era more persecuted faith. They worship the moon and draw their magical connection from it rather than the sun. The Solari have spent significant effort suppressing the Lunari, partly out of genuine religious conviction that the moon represents darkness and therefore opposition to the divine, and partly out of the kind of institutional self-interest that every dominant religious power eventually develops. The Lunari, during the period before Diana's return, had been driven so completely underground that most people at the mountain's base believed they had been entirely eliminated. They hadn't, but they were very nearly gone. The conflict between these two faiths, sun versus moon, light versus dark, certainty versus mystery, is the central human drama of Targon. And it gets most complicated in the two people who became its most important combatants, Leona and Diana. Leona and Diana grew up together within the Solari faith, both trained as warriors, both exceptional, both forming a bond that was more complicated and more important than a simple friendship between two capable people. Leona was everything the Solari wanted, devoted, gifted, absolutely committed to the sun's supremacy and to the duties that came with it. She rose through the ranks of the Rahorak on pure ability and genuine faith, not performed faith, not institutional compliance, but the real thing. She believed, she climbed, she endured the visions. And the aspect of the sun chose her, transforming her into something that burns with celestial solar fire, her skin shimmering with starlight, her eyes carrying the focused intensity of something that has looked directly at the sun and not flinched. Diana's story is more tragic and more complicated. She was an orphan, struggling to understand Solari teachings that felt, to her, incomplete. Where Leona found answers in the sun, Diana found questions. The sacred texts she was given seemed to be missing something. References to celestial bodies that weren't the sun, traditions that had been edited or removed, gaps in the doctrine that her sharp mind couldn't stop picking at. When other students and teachers dismissed her questioning as disrespect, Leona stayed, debated with her, tried to help her find what she was looking for in a faith that had already decided what the answers were. Diana found it herself eventually, not in the official texts but in ancient ruins on the mountain's upper slopes, ruins that predated the Solari faith, that contained records of a tradition the Solari had been suppressing for centuries. The Lunari, the moon, the other half of the celestial truth that the Solari's doctrine had carved out of history. She climbed, she reached the summit, and the aspect of the moon, which had been waiting for a host for perhaps hundreds of years, found in Diana exactly what it had been looking for, someone who would not be satisfied with half of the truth. She came back down the mountain as the embodiment of lunar power, silver armor, crescent blade, eyes carrying the cool focused light of the moon. And the Solari, whose entire institutional identity was built on the premise that the sun was supreme and the moon was nothing, saw in Diana an existential threat. They sentenced her to execution. What followed was not an execution. Diana survived. The Ra-Horak who came for her did not. And Diana, transformed, powerful, and carrying a fury born from a lifetime of being told that what she was looking for didn't exist, and then finding it, descended into the Solari's sacred places and destroyed what she found there. The destruction Diana caused in that initial rage was significant and real. She was not simply defending herself, she was tearing apart something that had spent centuries erasing her tradition. The sacred Solari sites she destroyed were not innocent architecture. They were the physical expression of a system that had imprisoned and killed Lunari believers for generations. Her fury was not irrational. It was also not surgical. In the immediate aftermath of her transformation, Diana was not capable of being surgical. The tragedy at the center of their relationship is that Leona had nothing to do with the execution order. She was not among those who condemned Diana. And Diana, in her rage, did not stop to find out who specifically had moved against her before she moved against the Solari. The two people who had been each other's most important relationship are now on opposite sides of a conflict that neither of them fully chose. They still carry what they were to each other. The lore makes this clear in the small, devastating details, the way they each speak about the other when they think no one is listening, the way neither of them has been able to fully close the door on something that should have stayed open. They are working towards something that looks from certain angles like reconciliation. Leona has been questioning, quietly, internally, in the way that faith sometimes questions itself when the institution built around it does something the faith cannot justify. Whether the Solari's suppression of the Lunari was ever right, regardless of the theological question. Diana has been learning, slowly, that the rage that saved her life is not the same thing as wisdom about what to do next. The question is whether the institutions they have each become entangled with will allow what both of them want underneath the conflict. Before we move into the individual champion stories, it is worth pausing to understand what daily life looks like for the people who have always lived in the mountain's shadow. Because the drama of aspects and cosmic betrayals tends to overshadow the fact that there are ordinary communities here, people who were born at the base of the world's most dangerous mountain and simply live there, generation after generation, without being chosen by anything divine. The Rakor are the most significant of these groups, the warlike tribe from which Atreus came and from whose broader culture both the Solari and Lunari grew. They are defined by the belief that combat is the highest form of human expression. Not combat for conquest or resource acquisition, though those things happen too, but combat as a philosophical practice, the testing of oneself against genuine opposition, the understanding of your own limits through the only method that truly reveals them. Children are trained to fight from the time they can hold a weapon, not brutally. The Rakor have a sophisticated martial tradition, and the early training is technically precise rather than simply hardening. The goal is not to produce children who are numb to pain, but to produce adults who understand the geometry of a fight at a level that bypasses conscious thought. Muscle memory over decision-making. The body knowing what to do before the mind has finished asking. The Rakor's relationship with the mountain is one of respect and aspiration. They are aware, more than any other group at its base, of exactly how difficult the climb is and how rarely it produces an aspect host. Most Rakor warriors who attempt the climb die on it. They accept this. The climb is not primarily about reaching the summit. It is about finding out who you are when the mountain is trying to kill you, and you are trying not to be killed. Whether you come back with a God inside you or simply come back, you return having learned something that could not be learned any other way. This cultural attitude produces an interesting relationship with the champions who do return from the summit transformed. The Rakor revere Leona and respected the aspect of war when it inhabited Atreus. They are aware that the divine selection says something about the person chosen, and they take pride in that. But they also understand that the mountain tests everyone the same way, regardless of outcome. The one who dies on the fourth slope and the one who reaches the summit and returns with celestial fire both went through the same test. The outcome differs. The courage required is the same. Of all the stories that come from Targon, Pantheon's is the one that most directly asks the question the region tends to raise in the background of every other story. What happens to the person when the aspect arrives? Atreus was born among the Rakor, the most intensely warlike of the tribes at Targon's base, a people who considered combat the highest expression of a human life and who raised their children to understand this from birth. He was a warrior by upbringing and by genuine inclination, not a reluctant soldier, not someone pushed toward violence by circumstance, but someone who genuinely understood what the Rakor were and chose to be a full expression of it. He climbed Mount Targon. He reached the summit. The aspect of war descended into him, and he became Pantheon, the unbreakable spear, the living weapon, an entity of almost incomprehensible martial power that could face down demigods and not be the one to step back first. For a long time, Atreus and the aspect coexisted, functioned, even thrived. The aspect of war had a host with genuine martial aptitude rather than someone simply performing the role, and Atreus had access to power that let him be what he had always been at the absolute limit of possibility. Then Aatrox came. Aatrox is one of the Darken, the fallen ascended, the weapons with souls, and in terms of the threat hierarchy that the aspects were built to address, he sits very high on the list. The battle between the aspect of war and Aatrox was not a contest with a predetermined outcome. Aatrox struck something in that fight that essentially unmade the aspect entirely, shattered it, removed it from Atreus as a presence. What was left was just Atreus, a man who had survived something that should have killed him, who had been hollowed out by the loss of a divine presence and was still breathing, still standing, still holding the aspect's weapons in hands that no longer had celestial power to draw on. Most people in that position would have accepted the end. The aspect was gone. The power was gone. The cosmic purpose was gone. By any reasonable accounting, Atreus was done. He was not done. He picked up the weapons, not because the aspect told him to, not because any divine force commanded it, because Atreus had been a warrior before the aspect arrived, and he was a warrior still, and the things the aspect had been fighting were still out there, and still dangerous, and someone needed to stand against them. The aspect's weapons still function in his hands, not because celestial power runs through them. It doesn't, not anymore, but because the weapons respond to the will of someone who refuses to stop. Atreus's mortal defiance has become, in its own way, a kind of power, not divine power, something stubborner and in some ways more interesting than that. He opposes the aspects now, including the ones still present in Leona and Diana, not out of bitterness, but out of conviction. He has seen what the aspect's priorities look like from the inside. He knows that the cosmic agenda and the human cost are not always the same thing. And he has decided that mortal lives matter independently of whatever cosmic strategy the aspects are pursuing. He opposes the aspects now, including the ones still present in Leona and Diana, not out of bitterness, but out of conviction. He has seen what the aspect's priorities look like from the inside. He knows that the cosmic agenda and the human cost are not always the same thing. And he has decided that mortal lives matter independently of whatever cosmic strategy the aspects are pursuing. The weapons he carries, the aspect's spear and shield, are interesting objects in this context. They were designed to be instruments of divine will. They responded to the aspect's power because the aspect was the source of their energy. After the aspect was destroyed, they should have been inert, dead weight, decorative at best. They are not. They still function. Not quite the way they did when the aspect inhabited him. The power level is different. The celestial fire is gone. But they respond to Atreus's will, to his refusal, to whatever quality it is in him that made the mountain's visions unable to turn him back. The Rakor would say that a warrior's spirit has its own power, and that this is simply proof. The aspects would probably have a more complicated explanation. Atreus himself doesn't particularly care about the explanation. He just picks up the spear every morning and continues. There is something genuinely moving about that position. In a region defined by beings of impossible power, the most compelling figure might be the man who survived one and decided that was enough. Now we come to the being who exists entirely outside the Targon story's normal scale, the entity whose presence makes even the aspects look small. Aurelion Sol did not originate from Runeterra. He did not originate from anywhere near Runeterra. He is a being who was present at the beginning of the universe itself, not as an observer, but as a participant. He forges stars, not metaphorically. He creates new suns, populates the void of space with light and gravity and the possibility of planetary systems. He is, in terms of raw cosmological significance, among the most important beings in the League of Legends universe. He came to Runeterra because the aspects were paying so much attention to this particular small world. For a being who had been forging stars since the dawn of time, this kind of concentrated celestial interest was unusual enough to be curious about. He descended in the form of a vast dragon, because a vast dragon seemed like an appropriately scaled form for approaching a mortal world, and the early civilizations of Runeterra, who had never seen anything remotely like him, responded with the thing mortal civilizations respond with when they see something incomprehensible: worship. He was named Aurelion Sol, for the sun he had forged for this world, the sun that made life here possible. And the Targonians, overwhelmed with gratitude, said they had a gift for him. The crown was beautiful. It seemed from the outside like an appropriate token of appreciation, something ornamental, something symbolic of the esteem in which he was held. When it touched his head, it didn't come off. The crown was a trap, a specifically, elaborately designed magical binding that connected to the deepest knowledge Aurelion Sol possessed, the knowledge of how to create the sun that made Runeterra's life possible. The aspects pulled that knowledge from him through the crown, allowing them to guide the creation of Shurima's sun disk and everything that followed from it. And the crown bound him to Runeterra, prevented him from leaving, and established a direct command link the aspects could compel him to act. Think about what that means for a moment. A being who forged suns, who populated the void of space with the raw material for solar systems, who was present when the first stars ignited in an empty universe. That being was now being ordered around by entities who, from his perspective, were roughly equivalent to someone who learned to use a lighter telling a volcano what to do. He has been enslaved since that moment, forced to close void rifts on Runeterra's behalf, forced to remain in proximity to a world he has come to actively dislike because of what was done to him there. The crown's magic periodically requires him to perform whatever task the aspects deem necessary, and he cannot refuse. What he can do is wait and plan and articulate with the thoroughness of someone who has had thousands of years to get the wording exactly right, precisely what he intends to do when the crown finally fails. The fragments of its binding magic have been falling to Runeterra like meteors, visible in the night sky, which is an omen the people at Targon's base have been interpreting with increasing anxiety. The crown is degrading. Its hold on him is weakening. The day he is free is approaching. His response to this situation combines several things. A fury so vast and so deep that it has been accumulating for thousands of years. An absolute certainty about what he plans to do when free, and a surprising wry humor about the whole thing that comes from the perspective of something that has seen too much of the cosmos to be genuinely destabilized even by captivity. He is furious and patient simultaneously, which is a combination that tends to be very dangerous when it finally resolves. He dislikes Runeterra. He dislikes the aspects. He dislikes the entire arrangement with a specificity and a fluency that suggests he has had a great deal of time to articulate it precisely. But there is one thing that has complicated his plans for spectacular revenge. Zoe. The aspect of Twilight is different from the other aspects in ways that even the aspects themselves find difficult to explain. Where the aspect of the sun chose a warrior defined by conviction, and the aspect of the moon chose a scholar defined by the pursuit of truth, the aspect of Twilight chose a child. Zoe was a Rakor girl, imaginative, mischievous, constantly in trouble with her teachers for not paying attention to things she found boring, which was most things. She was not training for war. She was not on a spiritual quest. She was skipping class. The aspect followed her escape from her teachers for about an hour, watching. Then it placed 6 items in front of her. She picked the only one that appeared to be completely useless, a toy ball, kicked it into a nearby building, and laughed as it bounced around her teachers. This was, apparently, exactly the right answer. Zoe became the aspect of Twilight, the herald of change, the messenger who appears before major cosmic events to signal that something significant is approaching. Her mere presence in a region tends to produce unintended magical side effects. Reality near her is slightly more flexible than it should be. This is not malice. She doesn't intend the cataclysms that sometimes accompany her visits. It is simply that someone who embodies change, concentrated in mortal form, is inherently destabilizing to the fabric of things. She is genuinely, uncomplicatedly joyful most of the time. She experiences time differently than mortals do. She has blinked in and out of Runeterra over the centuries, and what feels like a brief absence to her has sometimes been hundreds of years in mortal time. She watched Mordekaiser's rise and fall from a distance. She witnessed the destruction of the Blessed Isles. She has context for things that most immortal beings don't have, but she carries it lightly, like everything else. Her relationship with Aurelion Sol is the sweetest detail in all of Targon's lore. Every other being in Runeterra, mortal and divine, treated him as either a threat to be managed or a resource to be used. Zoe visits him, talks to him, not in a manipulative way. She is incapable of sustained manipulation, having the attention span of someone whose idea of cosmic responsibility is picking the only useless item when given. A cosmic multiple choice test. She just finds him interesting and feels genuinely bad about what was done to him. He tolerates this, which from a being who intends to destroy Runeterra once he is free, is not nothing. Taric, the gem, Knight of Targon. Taric's story begins with a failure and ends with the kind of purpose that only comes from genuinely hitting bottom. He was born in Dalmatia, the kingdom of martial honor and anti-magic sentiment, and was, by Dalmatian standards, the wrong kind of soldier. Too gentle, too curious, too interested in the beauty of ruins and the color of the sky at dusk. He rose through the ranks anyway, on genuine ability, until he reached the elite dauntless vanguard and found himself under a code of conduct that required him to be more narrowly defined than he was capable of being. The catastrophe came when he abandoned his post to explore an ancient ruin nearby, just for a little while, and in his absence his sword captain and that officer's entire retinue were killed. By Dalmatian law, this was punishable by death. Garen Crownguard, who had become the Vanguard's new sword captain and who owed Taric a friendship, commuted the sentence to exile. He climbed Mount Targon, not as a spiritual seeker, as someone who had nowhere else to go. He endured the visions. They showed him exactly what he had done and exactly who was dead because of it, with the mountain's characteristic refusal to let you look away. He did not look away. He kept climbing. At the summit, the aspect of the protector chose him, transformed him into the guardian of all life, love, and beauty in Runeterra, the being responsible for standing between the world and whatever comes to unmake it from the void or anywhere else. His magical power centers on healing, on protection, on making the people around him stronger. He is, in the cosmic economy of Targon's champions, the one whose purpose is most clearly and simply good. He is also in his personal warmth and his lack of interest in the region's internal political conflicts, one of the more quietly stabilizing presences around the mountain. He does not participate in the Solari Lunari war. He does not take sides in the aspect's various disagreements. He guards the world. That is enough. Aphelios, the weapon of the faithful. Aphelios is the last active member of the Lunari, or one of the last, depending on where Diana's search leads, and his story is one of the most quietly devastating in the entire region. He and his twin sister Alune were born to the Lunari faith and raised within it during its most persecuted period. Their abilities are complementary and connected in a way that suggests something deeper than coincidence. Alune can channel the moon's power into a physical form, and Aphelios is the one who wields it. Together, they are a single weapon. She, the magical source, he, the physical expression. Before a key ritual that would give him access to 5 powerful moon weapons, Aphelios drank a poison called Alune, named after his sister, which is not a coincidence, that gives him access to greater celestial power at the cost of his ability to speak. He cannot talk. He communicates through his sister's voice, channeled from wherever she is during their separation, and through the language of his weapons and his actions. He carries 5 weapons simultaneously, cycling between them, each with a different elemental moon property, each requiring a different set of skills and a different tactical application. The mastery of 5 entirely different weapon forms would be extraordinary for any warrior. Aphelios does it in silence, alone, guided by a sister's voice from across a distance neither of them can close. His loneliness is immense, his devotion is complete. He is fighting for something he believes in, with someone he loves, in a way that makes it impossible for either of them to simply be together. Soraka, the Star Child. Soraka occupies a unique position in Targon's cosmology because she is not an aspect host. She is a celestial, a being whose nature is fundamentally cosmic in the way that Aurelion Sol's is, though on a different scale and with entirely different values. She looked down at Runeterra from above for a long time, watching the mortals with the mild concern of a being that can see the whole pattern from a distance. From above, human chaos looked like noise. Up close, she descended, took mortal form, felt what it was to be cold and hungry and uncertain and capable of both extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary kindness. It looked entirely different. The chaos was not noise. It was the texture of a life being fully lived by beings that did not have the luxury of a cosmic perspective. She gave up her immortality, chose to remain in mortal form rather than return to the celestial realm, not because she was trapped, because she decided that the most useful thing she could do with the power she had was stay here, in the world, close to the people who needed what she could offer. She heals. That is her gift and her practice and her entire orientation toward the world. She has traveled across Runeterra for centuries, finding people who are hurt and helping them. She does not ask whether they deserve it. She has seen enough of the world to know that the question of who deserves mercy is less interesting than the fact that mercy, offered, tends to produce more of itself in the world. She lives now on the western peaks of Mount Targon, teaching healing to the Otrani Vastaya who make those slopes their home. She is, among all of Targon's champions, the one whose purpose is most clearly oriented toward the individual rather than the cosmic, toward this specific person in pain rather than the abstract preservation of the world. Kayle and Morgana. The Judicator and the fallen Kayle and Morgana are twins born to a Targonian woman named Mihira, a mortal who had been chosen as a host by the aspect of justice, and a Dalmatian man named Kilam. Their birth was complicated by the aspect's presence. Mihira had the power of celestial justice within her, which at the moment of birth transferred to her daughters, not to one of them, to both of them, split down the middle in ways that neither of them fully chose. Kayle received justice's more martial, punishing aspect, the part that sees the world in terms of law and violation, that is drawn toward the clarity of absolute standards applied without exception. She is methodical, exacting, and increasingly cold over millennia of applying divine justice to a world that is not always clear-cut. Morgana received the mercy, the part of justice that asks not only whether something was wrong, but why, that insists on context, that refuses to condemn without understanding. She is warmer, but carries a grief that Kayle does not, because mercy in a world full of pain is its own kind of burden. They disagree profoundly, consistently, in ways that have put them at cross purposes for thousands of years, about what justice actually means, whether the law is justice or whether mercy is, whether absolutes serve the world or damage it. Neither of them is entirely wrong, and neither of them is entirely right. Kayle has gone to Targon Prime to find answers about their mother, whose final fate remains unclear. What she finds there will likely change her understanding of what she is and what she was built for. Targon is at a crossroads that the mountain has been building toward for a long time. Multiple aspect hosts are active simultaneously, something that is apparently extremely unusual. Leona, Diana, and Pantheon's resurrection as his mortal self with the aspect's weapons, plus the aspect of Twilight's return in Zoe, constitute more active aspect presence in Runeterra than has been seen in recent history. The people at the mountain's base interpret this as a sign that something large is coming. They are probably right. The Solari Lunari conflict is not resolved. Leona and Diana are moving toward each other rather than simply staying in opposition, but the institutions they each represent still carry deep and old wounds. Aphelios is searching for the remnants of the Lunari. Leona is following. The question of whether that search ends in another war or in something better is genuinely open. Aurelion Sol's crown is weakening. The fragments of his binding magic have been falling to Runeterra like meteors, and his attention has been focused on Runeterra with increasing intensity as he feels the constraint begin to slip. What happens when it finally fails is one of the most significant unresolved questions in all of Runeterra's lore. A being of star-forging power with thousands of years of legitimate grievance, finally free to act. Zoe is watching all of it. She has seen things like this before in the long centuries of her existence. Major upheaval, she says, tends to announce itself in exactly this kind of clustering of omens. Whether what is coming is destruction or transformation, or both simultaneously, she doesn't say. She just watches and smiles and throws her toy ball at the building. The fire is burning lower now. The stars outside are the same ones that watched Atreus climb the mountain alone after losing everything. The same ones that watched Diana come back down transformed and furious. The same ones that Aurelion Sol forged in a time so distant it barely registers as the same continuum. Targon asks a question that the mountain's impossible scale seems to insist on. How do you maintain your humanity when something cosmic is involved? Every champion from this region faces a version of that question. Leona received divine fire and kept her faith but lost her friend. Diana found the truth she was looking for and lost the community she had. Atreus lost his aspect and found himself. Taric failed and climbed and became what the failure made room for. Aphelios sacrificed his voice for a belief he doesn't question. Soraka gave up immortality to be close to people who hurt. Aurelion Sol was tricked and waits with the patience of something that made the sun. None of these are simple stories. The mountain doesn't produce simple stories. It strips away everything that isn't essential, and then it asks, what are you without all of that? The answers are different for everyone. That's what makes the stars worth watching. Sleep well, wanderer. The mountain will still be there in the morning.